Okay, so there's the knife and the elk antler handle scales ready to be drilled for the knife. One of the things I have found is when using raw antler for handle scales, it's really easy to get a lot thicker pieces than you realize. I think that's because they naturally taper down on the edges because it's a mostly round piece of material. And so you stop and look at it, the thickest part in the middle is actually that's at least 3/8 of an inch on this end, which 3/8 is generally plenty of thickness for a handle scale. Usually, maybe even too much if you're not going to take down some of the thickness and contour of the handle, which on these I'm not, because the whole point of a natural elk antler handle is to leave the antler. So it's just going to be obviously formed or shaped to the tang, and that's going to be cleaned up real well. And then at the front of the knife, this portion is going to be cleaned up and rounded. But for the most part, you want to leave all of that natural finish. And so you kind of have to keep an eye on how thick your scales are. And I actually took out about 1/8 of an inch thickness with the table saw blade off of this one. This one was pretty much okay. And then I also came over to the big sander, 36 grit wheel, and cleaned them up some more. So as you can probably see, that's a lot thinner than the original antler, and that feels real good right there. So that's going to be about perfect. I am going to line up these handle scales where I want them. I'm leaving enough room to actually do this one on this side. No, leaving enough room to finish off this front part, because that's the part you really can't do after you have it glued up to the knife. Okay, and just clamp that right there like so. Okay. Generally speaking, I always run my drill press table way off to the side like this, and run the bit through the side slot if necessary. Usually I have a block. The reason for that is because when you're trying to drill a setup like this, obviously you got to have the clearance, and so this works quite well. Now I'm inside where it's warm because it's quite cold outside. Now this 2-ton epoxy is a 30-minute set, so that gives you plenty of time to get it mixed, get it on your handle scales and tang, and get your pins in and all of that. There's nothing wrong with like the 5-minute epoxy, 5-minute set epoxy. It usually has a little bit lower PSI strength, but still very sufficient for knives. But the main drawback to that, to the 5-minute epoxy, is that it gives you very limited time to get your knife put together before it starts setting up on you real well. And especially if you're new to knife making, that can be a real issue. You know, I've had times where I had to really kind of put things together really fast just to get everything together before, because I could tell it was starting to get a little stiff on me. So again, making sure I know which way my knife is setting on the scales. So I usually do one scale, and then I'll come over and do the tang and make sure any epoxy rivet holes or weight reduction holes I have are filled in nicely. You'll see that there's some epoxy spread around on the outside of these scales here, and because this is our final finish, being a natural antler handle piece, you gotta clean these off, because you can't leave that on there because you're not sanding or grinding this off. You also want to just make sure you don't scar up the outside of the handle scale, because once again that's what you're going to be looking at from that day forward. Clean up the epoxy that inevitably squeezes out around the front, and like I say, this is much easier. In the time that I've spent clamping this these handle scales on here, if I had been using 5-minute epoxy, this epoxy would have already been set up too much for me to wipe it off, and that would have been unfortunate. Would have had to clean it off some other way. So the epoxy is set on the handle and the clamps are off, obviously. Everything looks good. The next step is to peen over these rivets on each side. Before I do that, I'm going to trim them down a little bit with the grinder, so I'm not trying to peen over a whole bunch. You want to make sure you get the end of the pin or rivet contacting the anvil or whatever. On both sides as you do that. So that you're not trying to, so you don't end up basically driving the pin through instead of peening it on the other end. Cleaned up the handle scales around the tang, and also roughly rounded the corners a little bit so it's a nicer grip. Okay, so the handle is done, except for buffing, which is what I'm going to do next. All the former edges are smooth and rounded, so it makes a good grip for the knife now. And like I said, the next thing to do is to buff pretty much everything. I buffed the sanded portions of the antler. Stay away from this part still, but touch up the rivets a little bit. Do the blade, and then after that, etch my maker's mark on it and put an edge on the blade, which is the last thing to do. And the knife will be finished and ready to use. So this is the knife completed, essentially. It's buffed out there. It's kind of hard to see in this lighting. It really brings out the forged finish on it up at towards the spine, and the rivets are buffed and they still have the peen marks on them, so that's neat. The only thing left to do on this is to put an edge on it, which I generally do after I have a sheath made for it, so I don't have a sharp knife sitting around. And they have the my logo etched on there, and this is a very functional, handmade, rustic, traditional looking knife. There's knives out there that are sort of replicas and that kind of thing, or whatever. This is 100% made to be used, and it looks pretty rustic and traditional, and that's exactly what I try to do with this particular model of knife that I sell. And so I thank you guys for watching.